Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from wherever it is that you might be joining us from. Let me start by saying on behalf of the Asian Development Bank and the Pacific Asia Travel Association, a warm welcome for joining us at today's panel discussion, Policies and Practices to Foster Sustainable Tourism After COVID-19. I'm Stephen Schipani, and I'm a Principal Tourism Industry Specialist with the Asian Development Bank. I'll be your moderator today of what promises to be an engaging discussion. Our session is going to draw on the recently published report, Sustainable Tourism After COVID-19, Insights and Recommendations for Asia and the Pacific. I believe the report is downloadable from the menu that you see in your screen on the left-hand side. And today, we feature some amazing tourism policymakers and practitioners that are working hard every day to foster sustainable tourism transformations in Southeast Asia and really across the Asia-Pacific region. Before we go into the discussion, I'd like everyone to please join me in welcoming our esteemed panelists. First, we have Maria Helena de Senna Fernandes. She is the director of the Macao Government Tourism Office. We have Ms. Chompan Kulnadis. Chompan is the head of sustainability at Minor International, PLC. Next, an old friend, Mantira Horangora Unakun. Mantira is a cultural heritage specialist with the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. We know this is UNESCO, and Mantira, she's based in Bangkok, Thailand. And finally, with Suzanne Becken. Suzanne's a professor of sustainable tourism at Griffith University in Australia. I believe Suzanne is joining us from New Zealand. So Suzanne, you may be the furthest one away from everyone else on the panel. But a warm welcome to everyone, and thank you for taking your afternoon to appear on the panel and share some insight with us today. Now, while I was hoping for an in-person symposium this year, we've done this online the last couple of sessions. Meeting online, once again, it reminds us that the COVID-19 pandemic, it continues to negatively impact travel and tourism in Southeast Asia, really across the world. There's still many business closures and millions of people have lost their jobs. This is slowing progress toward the Sustainable Development Goals. And, although the pause in the tourism activity, it really has brought hardship to isolated many communities, it does offer a unique opportunity to address some of these structural issues that were undermining sustainability and to build forward better for people on the planet. Now, sustainable tourism, it can mean different things to different people. So I'll seek the panel's consent that for today's discussion, we'll be talking about tourism that's directly contributing to the Sustainable Development Goals. It's not just ecotourism or nature-based tourism, and it's certainly more than tourism that's financially self-sustaining. So in this context, the panel will be discussing some factors that we think can help enable a sustainable recovery around things like good governance and policy making, which goes beyond economic goals and works in social and environmental concerns, appropriate investments in infrastructure, education and training for tourism workers, and certainly the use of technology, which has become so ubiquitous in our lives. And finally, making good quality and high quality data and research widely available for evidence-based policy making. We really hope, we know that you'll take away some concrete ideas that can be applied in Southeast Asia in your work and beyond. So let's go ahead and get started. Firstly, I'd like to go to Helena. And Helena, if you could just speak a little bit about, Macao's COVID-19 response and recovery policies. Please, Helena, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Stephen, and obviously, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to to all of you who are joining us in this panel, because I think it's and thank you for having me on this panel, because I think it's always a very good possibility to learn from each other and also to see what are the good practices. Well, from our side, I'd like to share that before the pandemic in 2019, that was the best year for Macao in terms of tourism. We had 39.4 million visitors at that point in time. Everybody was talking about over tourism. Everybody was saying that, oh, we don't need that many tourists. But then, you really learn the hard way how things can just turn around from one day to another. So last year, we're quite happy to see that we have 7.7 million visitors, better than 2020, which we only had about 5 million visitors. So things are getting back on, slightly better, but there is still a long way to go. And being such a small place, Macao, which relies very much on tourism as our main income earner, business has been very, difficult for a lot of people. It's not easy. And that's why I think, we need to really try to go back and work hard in terms of, our and getting visitors back to Macau. So in order to let me share a simple slide to so that you know that what is the four-prong approach that we actually adopted. There you go. Oops. There you go. Okay. I think first and foremost, we actually use a lot of different measures in order to boost the local economy first. When tourists cannot come, the first people you go back to are your local people, because you actually need to have the tourism engine going and make sure that at least things are going ahead. So we turned to our own local community. We did tax exemptions. We did local programs for staycation, encouraging people to travel within our own place, although it's a small place. And then when and because of this kind of staycation packages, and because you are serving your own people, it's much more difficult than serving the tourists, because your own people, you know a lot about your own destination. So you have to be very, you have to actually give them a lot of reasons to travel around your own, neighborhood. So that's why it gave rise to a lot of new tourism products, which now we're able to apply to the visitor market. So when we're able to come up with all these new products, we go back to new forms of promotion, which combines both online and offline. Unfortunately, I'd like to see more offline promotions, but I think right now online promotion is key to keep ourselves visible and also to give confidence to people. The messages that we craft also are quite different from what used to be. Before the pandemic, we were talking about what things to do and what are the nice things to have in Macau. But now we're talking more about how safe the destination can be. And also, what even if you travel, you don't have to worry a lot. So it's really a lot of confidence building before people can actually come back to your destination. And so finally, the four-prong approach, one buzzword that we're talking about very much is tourism plus, trying to use tourism as an anchor to bring in, I would say, businesses for different sectors, and also to help other sectors get back on their feet. We're talking about culture and creativity. We're talking about sports. We're talking about meetings, conventions. We're also talking about leveraging the e-commerce part of tourism. So it's this is the four-pronged approach that we are actually adopting in order to recover. It's still a long way to go before we are really back to comparable levels than before, but at least there is confidence that things will get back to normal.
Wow, that's amazing. I mean, we in 2021 back to more than 7 million arrivals. And one of the things I'd like to pick up on, Helena, which is important, is this idea of visitors feeling safe, but also visitors seeing that destinations are making efforts to be more sustainable. We've seen numerous online polls for, I'd say, consumers all around the world. Is this, safety and sustainability are really at the forefront now. So destinations that are able to position themselves in that way are certainly going to have a competitive advantage going forward. And what you put together here with you and your team is really amazing. I want to just dig a little bit deeper on a follow-up question, because it's interesting where, you mentioned Macau, the size of your destination isn't so big, but we know people in Macau have big hearts, right? This idea of tourism between Macau and mainland People's Republic of China, right? We know that that's important. Can you share with us how some of these tourism recovery practices that you've adopted during the pandemic are helping the industry move forward in terms of market diversification?
Well, I think we cannot continue to do business like what we did before. There was a lot of mass tourism. There was a lot of, and as I said, in 2019, everybody was talking about over tourism. So it's like, the pandemic, although obviously everybody hates it, I would say, but it has also given an opportunity for us to relook at what's happening, what we can do better, and how we can actually make everything more sustainable, both for the locals as well as for visitors coming into the place. So we have relooked at, last year we have relooked at our master plan of tourism. It has given us a lot of new insights as to how we should work together with our neighbors, how we can also develop new products. Where are the new segments? You don't need that many bodies, but you want people to be able to come to stay longer in your destination, to actually have the opportunity to, and they're able to spend, more, which contributes better to the economy. So it is a very important thing that, we continue to think about new ways of doing business. Don't actually go back to the pitfalls that we have had before. So that's the way that we see going forward, how we should actually learn from the old lessons and make, and give ourselves a new way forward.
Yeah, that's fantastic. This market diversification and, kind of this holy grail that we hear about can be less visitors in numbers, but if they can stay longer, if they can spend a little more, if they can use local products and services, it's certainly going to bode well for the destination going forward. That's great. And I think you really touched on one of these elements of place, right? In tourism, we talk about place, we talk about people, we talk about promotion, we talk about many things, but it's really encouraging to see and learn from some of these things that Macau has done since the pandemic. With that, we're going to go to people now. Okay, so I want to ask Chongpan now. Chongpan, before COVID-19, what I heard from a lot of people in the industry, it's always difficult to attract talented workers. And across Southeast Asia, things like seasonality sometimes would discourage people. Some argue it's long hours with low pay, and there is this idea of negative cultural perceptions of working in the tourism industry, in some markets in Southeast Asia and in other parts of the world. And this led some young people to seek other professions, outside the tourism and hospitality industry. Now, you're with Minor International, or Minor Group, actually, which I think is employing more than 50,000 workers across several markets globally. So you certainly seem to have a way of keeping your employees engaged, right? Could you walk us through some of the good practice examples of employment policies that I guess just the tourism and hospitality industry in general should be pursuing post-pandemic to ensure that we continue, to attract talented workers and retain them? Over to you, Chongpan.
Thank you, Stephen. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone as well. Talking about people development in tourism industry, we actually at Minor, we really put a lot of emphasis on the concept of people development, and that's from attraction to training to retaining and even to keep in touch with our alumni. So I think if you go back to your first comment on the tourism industry having low base pay, having some cultural issues, I think we have to look at working in tourism industry as a total reward rather than just the base pay. I think the base pay is probably sufficient for everyone to get by, decent living standard. But if we look at a total reward, and that's the attraction part, is that what do we, or what can we give to our potential employees? And that's beyond base pay. There'll be the standard things like, uniforms, food, accommodations, and stuff like that. But also there are opportunities to grow. And being in a hotel is like being in one big industry because there are so many departments. And if you really plan it well and you optimize your resources, they can actually work in different departments. They can get exposure to different things, different practices, and that kept them engaged. And that's one of the, I guess, the interesting part about being in travel industry. And on top of that, there are also opportunities, and especially in groups like us, where we actually have exposures in over 60 countries, there are rooms to grow. Not just cross departments, but cross properties, cross jurisdictions. So in many cases where we found is that we can entice our potential team members by saying, you actually already get exposed to multicultural settings in your hotel, but you also have that exposure to travel the world. And we really adhere to our concept of mobilizing our people. So we try to track and we try to see where our talents pool are. And then we go beyond and saying, we put that talent pool in our recruiting system. So our internal talents are featured in the recruiting system as well. So when other properties are looking for certain vacant positions, they can look at our internal pool first before actually going out. And that really helps us as well, because we have someone who already knows the culture, knows our practice, and also we can actually give them that opportunity to really retain them with us. So that's sort of the attraction side of things. But you also asked about training, and I think that's one of the big things that we really do. And COVID actually has brought about the opportunities to even speed up the training and the learning even more. We already have our so-called learning journeys, which is customized and designed for all team members from every level, from entry level to GM level. And that is actually, so if you're someone who has potential and willingness to learn, you can access into our system. I can just log on into our website and I'll see all the courses that are available there for my level. And that's really preparing yourself or equipping yourself to do the best in your current position and also to be prepared for the next position. So these are actually available both online and offline, more so online. But the nice thing is that because we have already started putting all of these or most of these online, because of our diverse geographic reach, we were able to really utilize it during COVID. So we don't have to have trainers go around. We already have our people being there online teaching you. We also access to different training platforms like eCornell and some of other third-party trainings. Also, we can customize that to the levels that is needed. So you can be, department heads, or you can be GMs. Even GM level, you have more rooms to explore into what you want to learn. And the way that is done, especially here at Minor, is that we don't control it from the center. So we have a person in charge who looks at all these learnings, develop the course and curriculums, seeing at all levels what would be needed. But again, then he cascaded down to the properties level. So he works together with not just the what we call the people and culture team, learning and development team, but he also works with GMs. He works with operations to understand the real need at the properties level and operations level. And at the properties, they have all these catalogs of learnings, which they can pick and choose to customize it to the way that that their properties actually require. So that gives a lot of flexibilities and also basically empower the properties to develop the people that they really need. So I think that works well, and it also helps with our central function, because we only have a handful of people, to really make sure that the trainings are reached, the trainings are available, and it can be practiced. And I think with that, it works out very, very well with our people. And I got some figures from them that last year we had something like 62,000 courses that was completed by over like 20-something thousand team members. So it actually has worked. And on top of that, in the regular time, we also work externally with the local communities in reaching out to them and also sharing our expertise and knowledge. But at the same time, that's our way in accessing the community to look for the potential talents. So we have programs where we work with vocational schools. We help them develop the curriculums. And then we have the students there that come back and intern with us. So that way we can actually, scout for talents before they actually become our employees. And then these students actually get accredited for their courses as well. So it's a win-win situation for them. And last year we just launched our hotel school. So we have Asian Institute of Hospitality Management, which was, we had our first batch last year. It offers the Bachelor in Management in Hospitality, and it's actually a collaboration between Minor and La Roche. So we can really, assure the quality of it. Unfortunately, we launched in COVID time, but we still have students interested in enrolling. And we took that opportunity saying, since we already have the facilities, we already have the courses, then we should just open that up to our team members as well. So Minor Hotels have been giving scholarships to some of our talents to come and learn and be students in this program.
That's fantastic. And when you said that, last year, Minor employees enrolled in 62,000 different training courses, one of my comments was going to be, wow, that's amazing. Another line of business might be setting up a university, but we see that you've already done that now. That's fantastic. And at this higher level management training, which, in a larger firm like Minor, there is this opportunity for lifelong growth and employment and advancement that's certainly attractive to people in the industry. But also your point on the relevance in industry-led training. Different places are going to require different types of training opportunities and needs there. So that's really fascinating the way you're able to adapt that. We don't have a one-size-fits-all, but we're able to adapt that for the needs of the different destinations that you're working in. One of the points about tourism and what type of skills are needed and what type of skills it builds is that I think is important is, when we come into this technology age now, these soft skills that you're training your people in and the people learn are tremendously important for any profession. So, while we do have opportunities for lifelong growth in the tourism and hospitality industry, we know that people that have been a frontline tourism worker, food and beverage services and others, sometimes they come away with soft skills and life skills that really enable them to work and do well in many, many professions, both inside and outside the tourism and hospitality industry. So that's great, the way these different programs that you have and the way you're able to, continue to develop your people. Fantastic. I want to go now back to place, and I'm going to go to Montira. Montira, this idea of being inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List is something that many destinations aspire to. And it's also a powerful incentive, for destinations to better protect and better to manage their cultural and their natural heritage.
So maybe I'll just pick up where hopefully I left off, which was to introduce you to the UNESCO Sustainable Travel Pledge, which we have started in cooperation with the Expedia Group. And while we had no audio, I was happy to show you sort of the silent movie walking you through this website and various parts of the website. Basically, it's a pledge that is offered to hotel operators whether independent operators or large chains. And actually, I'm happy to inform our minor colleague that many minor properties have already signed the Sustainable Travel Pledge in your portfolio hotel. So congratulations and thank you very much for giving this attention. And I think it's with the kind of the leadership of big players like Minor that I think we can collectively raise the bar of what it means to be sustainable travel. Basically, what this travel pledge entails is hotels can sign up. It doesn't mean that they are 100% perfect at what they do already, but it's a pledge, so it means that they pledge to get better in the way that they run their operations. And in keeping with sort of the spirit of World Heritage and the spirit of the things that UNESCO does, the pledge focuses on two main areas. One is on reducing environmental footprint and impact, and the second is on engaging with communities. And so in terms of the community engagement, the main thrust is how can hotels become platforms to encourage visitors to engage more with local communities and to be able to, either learn more from local communities, have a kind of a two-way dialogue, as well as to support them economically, but also to learn about local culture and so forth. So that communities are not just like service providers or, maybe hotel staff, but communities are also like brand ambassadors for basically their destinations. And many of these destinations being, World Heritage destinations are in fact, filled with interesting stories and interesting history and other types of cultural aspects that in many ways you can only really learn about if you're interacting with the local. So that's the first part of the pledge. The second part of the pledge in terms of environmental footprint, it means that hotels that are signing up for the pledge, make a commitment to reduce energy consumption, to reduce water consumption, to reduce waste, as well as to reduce single-use plastics. And the overlap between the community angle and the environmental angle is, for instance, when it comes to single-use plastics or it comes to waste, what we're trying to encourage is hotels to source local products as much as they can. So instead of buying, like mass-produced products that are imported, and then you have the whole issue of, the carbon footprint of all of that process of things being shipped from overseas and so forth, we're suggesting that can you support local manufacturers and local vendors who are, maybe they're using local products, local craft skills, local know-how, as well as local resources like materials and stuff as well. And so in this way, it's a kind of a win-win-win situation because yes, you're reducing plastics, you're creating jobs for local people, and your guests are also enjoying a local touch as well, so that your hotel offers kind of a unique experience. And so we have over 4,200 hotels that have signed up for this pledge. It actually started off fairly locally with a pilot phase in Thailand. And it's now gone global. And so we have both independent operators as well as big chains signing up. And associated with this, there's also some online training that is going to happen because, not all operators will have figured out how to do everything all at once. And so it's learning from other people in the industry and learning from, experts as well is one way to ensure that everyone, is raising the bar on the way that they do these things. And so that's kind of the first angle of building back better, which is, from the tourism angle, particularly with hotel operators who are at heritage sites and World Heritage sites. So, while a lot of hotels are maybe waiting for the influx of tourists and guests to come back, this is an opportunity for them to rejig some of their existing operations in ways that are more sustainable or friendly towards the environment or towards societies and better for their bottom line too, frankly. So that's what's going on. Now, when we look at the other aspects of building back better, which is the heritage sites themselves, the cultural institutions, the museums and other types of operators who are offering basically the heritage products that people, travel hundreds or thousands of kilometers to see. Obviously, this is also an opportunity to re-examine and also to build back better in another way. UNESCO has developed another tool, called the Visitor Management Assessment Tool, which has now expanded also to kind of a strategy development side as well. And it walks people, whether they're heritage site managers or government authorities or a private concession that's running a heritage site, it walks people through a process of understanding the patterns of visitor management at their site, as well as the patterns of visitor impact at their site. And it helps them to structure a response to respond to areas where they might be struggling with. So maybe visitors are creating a lot of trash, or maybe visitors are not respectful of local communities, or maybe visitors are coming on a tour bus and leaving, and they're not leaving behind any economic benefits. So whether it's economic, or whether it's social, or whether it's environmental, or whether it's a larger tourism governance issue, the VMAS tool, the Visitor Management Assessment Strategy tool, is helping heritage operators around the world actually come to an understanding of where the pain points are and how they can improve their heritage management operations in order to be able to better manage visitors. Again, in a kind of plus scenario where it's good for the heritage side, it's good for communities, but it's also yields an improved tourism experience. You know, visitors will come back to a place if they find that the visitor experience was meaningful and it was well managed. So if, you know, the heritage site is fantastic, but the toilets are terrible, you know, people will think twice. But on the other hand, if the toilets are fantastic, but the visitor experience, like you learned nothing when you went there, then, you know, your 60 Instagram photos from your one trip are enough, right? You never have to go back and Instagram that site again. So it's only going to be a win-win proposition if both sides are working together hand in hand. So I encourage, actually, if any visitors who are listening to us today, any operators or people coming to us from the heritage side are listening, you can look it up on the UNESCO website. The Visitor Management Assessment and Strategy tool can be another kind of tool in your arsenal in order to build back better from a heritage perspective. And then lastly, I want to share another slide, and this is sort of looking at the kind of the macro picture of things. I mean, obviously, tourism is a huge part of the economy in many of the countries that we're dealing with. You know, for instance, Thailand being maybe the first in that regard. But Macao as well, the Philippines, you know, tourism is a big employer. It's a big contributor to the GDP. There have been many studies about this, obviously, and a lot of national planning bodies and other kind of economic organizations are trying to rethink what the implications of this are. I mean, this might be a little bit heretical to bring up in a tourism, you know, roundtable where everyone is in the tourism industry. But if we take a step backwards and we look at the bigger picture of things, there are economies like the Thai economy or the Filipino economy where tourism is upwards of 20% of the GDP, you know, before COVID. So it means when your tourists disappear, it means 20% of your GDP is also disappearing. And clearly, you know, from a macroeconomic perspective, this is not kind of a viable a long-term perspective. Yes, we can wait for tourism to come back, but we also know that in some cases, some tourism sectors possibly may never come back. And I think that's the hard reality. And so we can substitute, you know, that shortfall with other markets. On the other hand, if there is going to be a permanent gap, then we have to consider what are the other possibilities. And I think, you know, UNWTO itself issued a report looking at impacts on the global tourism market and concluded that from a macroeconomic perspective, it's inevitable that economies that are super heavily tourism dependent will need to restructure their economies towards other things. Maybe they move towards digital industries, or maybe they're moving towards other kinds of service industries or whatever. And that's sort of the hard reality that faces us. And if we're able to make this transformation, then it means that ultimately economies and the labor market will be more resilient in a larger long-term way, even if there is another pandemic, or even if there is another crisis, or, you know, another major like war that is breaking out, you know, that will allow us to carry on in another way. And so economic diversification might involve moving to things that are near tourism. So maybe some of the healthcare and associated industries in terms of wellness are kind of a step and a half away from tourism, and that might be something that tourism facilities, hotel properties, and so forth can re-engineer themselves in a new way as wellness facilities. And these are the types of things that we've been talking about, and we're running a course now actually on looking at new business models for heritage properties, and wellness is one of the things that's being mentioned. But I'm sure the tourism industry itself has talked a lot about this, because actually the people who are hurting are the tourism operators. So I want to end maybe this first round of discussion on this point.
Thank you, Mantir, and also thank you. It's very fresh to hear a candid view that economies that are highly dependent on tourism should consider economic diversification for long-term resilience. And one thing that you mentioned, which goes back to Chongpan's point, is that people that work in the tourism industry, they have these soft skills, they have these life skills that can transition relatively easily to other parts of the service economy. So that certainly bodes well for what you shared with us on the last slide. Inside the tourism economy, this idea of diversifying experiences and strengthening experiences to be able to reach out to other markets, and perhaps markets too that are more willing to consume local products in a destination that can help to strengthen local economies and bring more people in, is something else I think that's kind of a very powerful lesson that's come out of your presentation. Thank you also for mentioning those tools. I know I'm on the UNESCO website often, and I've seen that the VMAP tool, very good. And you also touched on this issue of online training again, which is important, to continue to keep people, tourism workers and tourism managers trained to better manage their destinations. But one of the ones I also liked was this idea of partnerships. Maybe that's another P that we need to put in the tourism, promotion people, price and everything, is this idea of partnerships is very important. And thank you for sharing that interesting partnership that UNESCO has, with an online travel agent. Very nice. Before I go to the next panelist, before I go to Suzanne, Mantir, anything else on the top of your head on technology and visitor management at World Heritage Sites?
I think we've seen, of course, digital acceleration of digital transformation. I mean, that goes without saying. And a lot of sites, even sites that have not been very high tech in the past, have been forced, to go online. So we're seeing, virtual museums and virtual visits to World Heritage Sites, and in some cases, like guided, semi-virtual guided visits, where you can team up with a local community member and they're walking you around, the village or the site. And so in that way, it's like creating jobs for local people, and you get a more personal touch than just watching, some pre-made video. So I think there are a lot of responses to this, but the technology is probably ahead of our utilization of the technology. So like there are a lot of fancy bells and whistles out there that I think a lot of sites, government services in particular, haven't quite wrapped their heads around yet, how to make the best use of the technology. At the same time, there's also the question of, monetization. So yes, you can put your heritage museum or your heritage site online, but then, you can do that maybe as a public service because it's a public good. But on the other hand, how do you make up for lost ticket revenue? How do you make up for all the meals that were never had and all the souvenirs that were never sold? Is this something that the private sector needs to step in more in order to provide those facilities? And we have seen a lot of online booking services and queue management services and meal delivery services that are doing a lot of CSR in order to allow SMEs or micro enterprises like noodle sellers and whatnot to be able to continue to sell. So, but often it doesn't make up for the fact that a lot of these services are bundled. So you wouldn't have the noodles if you weren't visiting a Ayutthaya, and if you're not visiting a Ayutthaya, then then what happens to the noodle seller? So I think that sort of remains to be a challenge. And then of course the other challenge is sort of the ethics of it, the ethics of digital access to information, the ethics of digital access to sites. on the one hand, putting your entire collection of really precious antiques online. If you're a museum, it's almost like a catalog for please come and steal stuff from my museum, and I think this is a very real concern that museum curators really worry about. On the one hand, yes, there's open access to data and all of this kind of movement. And on the other hand, there's sort of the practical realities of making that data accessible to people who may not have pure intentions. But there's also, like, if we're looking at community-based tourism, which has been the trend in the last 15 or so years, giving people virtual access to community-based tourism also means, you're sitting in people's living rooms virtually, or you're taking part in their rituals, ceremonies virtually. And some of these rituals and ceremonies or whatever were never meant to be accessible to lots and lots of outsiders. And you can't always screen that access when stuff goes digital or stuff goes online. So I think there are a lot of things that we need to think through in order to make this a workable experience. And I mean, even experiences like today, the internet always goes out, your computer always goes out, the audio always goes out. So we're not quite at the point where these things are seamless yet. So even the quality of the experience is much, much less than if we were all together in a room, So I think these are some of the challenges moving forward. But we're working now, a lot of UNESCO has been approached by a lot of leading tech companies, and we've in conversations with Meta and so forth about how to utilize this technology in the culture sphere.
Good. So yeah, I mean, the opportunities are amazing, but I guess proceed with caution, especially when we're, have a camera in someone's house or there's something like this. I also like the idea though too, is this, having things virtually can have implications for helping to control visitors numbers. So, and overcrowding, especially at sensitive sites. So this is kind of the double-edged sword, but that's great, Montira. Thank you. We're going to go over to Suzanne because we want to hear, we know Suzanne has done some cutting edge research with the Asian Development Bank and certainly with the institutions that she's affiliated with. So, I mean, maybe Suzanne, just drawing on your research, including the work that we've done together on how to reshape tourism and make it more sustainable after COVID-19. I'm going to ask you kind of a double-barreled question, right? To maybe address two dimensions of sustainability and sustainable tourism policy. The first is, maybe it goes back to what I mentioned is today when we're talking about sustainable tourism, we're defining it around the sustainable development goals. But, what should we prioritize measuring? Recognizing that tourism, it really touches on so many dimensions of the economy and society and others. So, when we talk about sustainable tourism, what do we need to measure better? What should we be measuring, to help us get there? And the second point is, I think, you're going to share a green tourism policymaking framework that we know you've applied in different destinations. You've worked, with stakeholders to develop. Sometimes it's hard to get people to work together. And what have you seen has incentivized, different stakeholders to work together to help move the needle more towards sustainability and sustainable tourism? Over to you, Suzanne.
That's great, and kia ora from New Zealand to everyone. It's great to be here. I will actually start with the big picture briefly, and it really flows on nicely what Montira said, because I think this notion of building forward better is really important. I feel we're starting to get over the pandemic, fingers crossed. But I think there's a risk, of course, that we then lose sight of maybe the next trap that we might fall into. So this concept of resilience and actually really understanding some of the other crises that are still looming. In fact, just this week, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released another report, and it's sort of could be entitled a bit like Adapt or Die. Literally half of the world population is already really facing quite significant climate disruption. So what I do worry a little bit is that we get so enthusiastic about being over this pandemic, and governments and businesses alike invest without realizing that there's actually a lot of other things that need to be considered. So climate impacts, decarbonization. We all know that the oil prices have gone up a lot. And so where I sit, New Zealand or Australia, we're very concerned about that because the recovery of long-haul travel, of course, could get another blow. So we look at Envy at Macao, you've got a huge market at your doorstep. So I think every destination has a different set of parameters that really we are in a precarious situation with regards to the state of the planet in some of our systems. So we must not forget that. And so in terms of monitoring, then, Stephen, I think it has to be at multiple levels. One is really to understand almost the exposure to risk that we face. And when we put major tourism developments in place, whether it's new airports or even community-based tourism developments, and we hang the hopes of development on it, we need to be sure it's resilient. We need to monitor some of those external threats. We also need to understand the more sort of tourism internal issues. And one, it was touched on a little bit in the previous talks, this idea of over-tourism and social license. Just recently in Queenstown, New Zealand, which is probably one of the most sort of commonly known or busiest tourist towns, there was a survey of the local population, and even after 2 years of deprivation and actually quite a bit of economic hardship and downturn, 32% of local residents did not want tourism to come back like it was. So that's quite significant. And I think that's really important to remember. So one key variable to monitor is, of course, the local community sentiment towards tourism. There's a really good example from Vanuatu, where the government has teamed up with Planet Happiness. And so they do the Vanuatu Happiness Index survey to assess community well-being, sort of as a monitoring tool, but also to specifically assess, evaluate the intervention, for example, some COVID recovery measures. So whether we call it well-being or sustainability, it has to be multidimensional. And then there's, of course, some key indicators. I did mention carbon. Governments are starting to monitor carbon. More and more businesses, I'm sure you would have all seen the Glasgow Declaration at the last climate summit, where businesses sign up to net zero by 2050. The Norwegian government has come out with quite ambitious targets for reduction for tourism emissions. So I think it's a very multidimensional thing, certainly not enough to just monitor arrivals and expenditure anymore, because I think then there's a real risk for missing the boat and setting up for failure. I did want to talk briefly about policy, and you mentioned the framework, and part of good policy, of course, is to enable the transition and to enable resilience building, and also to enable good collaboration, which you mentioned. So I'm just trying, I'm trying to show you, because policy is often a bit, some people say it's a bit a dry subject. I think it's fascinating. And in some ways, one might argue policy enables so much other change. Now this looks a bit small. Now here, I think it looks okay. So when we think, okay, what the heck is tourism policy? There's some key areas that typically ministries of tourism would deal with. And arguably the biggest pot of interest is the one on the left. It's about tourism growth, competitiveness, and of course now after COVID, there's definitely an interest in sort of revival marketing campaigns, maybe attractive visa policies and type of investment. There's other areas too, and we talked about monitoring on the far right. But what I propose now, after this sort of shock that we have experienced and the learnings, is that we really need to extend the traditional policy making, and part of that is to really make sure we, in fact, not only extend, but we truly embed sustainability thinking into every type of decision making and policy that government makes, but also business decision making. So I give you a few examples here. The South Pacific Tourism Organization has really developed some quite forward-thinking policy frameworks after or in response to the COVID pandemic. And it's really highlighting the Pacific way, the uniqueness of Pacific culture and ecosystems, at the core of the purpose of having tourism, to protect ecosystems, to restore ocean health, to have thriving cultures. And that in itself then is seen as competitiveness, because then visitors want to visit, because it's quite an original experience. It's not just an off-the-shelf standardized product where the goal is sort of maximizing growth, but there's a different purpose to it. And the uniqueness of, I guess, the Pacific values comes through the whole experience. So that's one example. There's other examples like green investments into, for example, electric vehicle corridors. We talked about the pledge. UNESCO, some countries have developed country pledges and starting to develop systems for visitors to give back. And then, of course, there's the whole idea of partnerships. And I just give one example because I don't think we can solve all the problems without partnerships. Neither government nor industry can do it alone. One big roadblock is, for example, decarbonizing aviation. And so the airlines will never, because we're dealing with market failures, the airlines will not be able to get, for example, sustainable aviation fuels in the market without the help of government. So it really needs sort of new governance arrangements, partnerships where everyone can work together. It's about information sharing, it's about sharing of capital and resources, maximizing learnings, etc. So that's kind of an example of partnerships. How do you incentivize them? Hopefully the complexity of some of the problems in itself actually has already brought new players together. The pandemic is a really good example where tourism worked with health authority much more. We can in sort of learn from that to extend this type of policy integration across other domains. I mean, environment would be one, culture, we've talked about, social impacts, tourism working not in a silo, but across government and across different players. With that, I pause, and I'm sure you've got a few questions or comments as well.
I have one follow-up. In a minute, Suzanne, and actually for the people that are listening in on the panel, please submit any questions that you also have, through the platform. We're going to come to those in a minute. I see we have one or two have come in already. But I just want to follow up, Suzanne, on this idea of investment, right? We have investment on the public side, we have investment on the private side. One of the things we hear from a lot of people in the industry is that we're still struggling, we're still closed, we don't have finances for operations costs, never mind CapEx or other larger investments now. But we need, when it comes right at the time when the tourism industry probably needs it the most, right? So who's doing it well, or what is some? Maybe you have an example you can share from us on a destination or a business or a firm where you've seen it done well. Can you share that with us?
Yeah, and I agree. I mean, capital and finance is absolutely crucial for the transition. I do want to pick up though, because it often gets forgotten that some sustainability measures, of course, save costs. And I don't think we have fully exploited them in tourism. So if we become, for example, more resource efficient, and I saw it on the UNESCO website, we can be quite a bit smarter. And for example, technology can help with that to actually save money. So I think there's a little bit of room, but fully agree, we need investment. Some governments have built that in the recovery packages. So for example, France has given a significant loans to tourism businesses for renovations, increasing, for example, insulation and so on. We haven't done it enough, but there's still a chance for governments to really purposefully invest and support business greening of infrastructure and assets. I think that's an opportunity for governments. There's also, of course, in the financial sector, there's instruments like green loans. Not so many examples in tourism because often tourism projects are a bit smaller, but for example, the Langham Hospitality Group in Hong Kong is a really good example of using sustainability-linked loans. And a recent example from Thailand is the Destination Capital Group that also has developed specifically a green hotel fund to basically acquire hotels and then bring them absolutely up to scratch with sustainability performance. I think, Stephen, we can do better in tourism, but there's enough examples now emerging to learn and then develop the instruments.
Suzanne, also one quick one too, but before I go, I want to dig a little bit deeper on Monteiro on this issue of entry fees and access to World Heritage sites. You mentioned more than 30%, that's a third of the people didn't want tourism to return to their destinations. Why was that? What are some of the top reasons that we heard of why we had some reluctance to go back to the way things were?
Yeah, traffic congestion, crowding, just too busy. So it's probably very similar in other destinations. I still found it a little bit surprising and probably a little bit concerning for the tourism industry, because you really can't do tourism recovery against the will of the population.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, because what I've been hearing is we want the tourists back. You know, how do we get the tourists back as quickly as possible? So we have many opinions on that. Building on this issue of cost and finance is a little bit relevant, Manthira. Do you think there's going to be an increase in say entry fees or other costs, you know, to access, you know, World Heritage sites or other sites? Because we know that many governments, their fiscal position is stretched now, destinations, and once tourism gets back, do you think prices are going to go up? And you see all around the world, prices are increasing. We hear about inflation, increasing prices now. And you know, what would be the implications for residents? You know, one of the things is we want to promote local people, you know, visiting and accessing and having access to heritage resources. How can we ensure equitable access to some of these heritage sites going forward as we come out of the pandemic?
I think it's quite unlikely that we would see a spike in prices, you know, to visit World Heritage sites. At least, I mean, I think at many heritage destinations, they are treated as public goods, and so access to public goods is often, you know, set at a price point that is affordable, and in some cases, it's actually probably underpriced. And so we see, you know, in Thailand, it costs, you know, like, you know, $1, a couple dollars to go to a historic park or something, and that's probably well below maintenance costs. You know, so it's subsidized by the government, and so we. And we see, you know, in lots of the kind of like short-term tourism promotion campaigns, like trying to target domestic tourists or whatever, that in fact, one of the things that's often promoted is like, we've cut the prices to zero, free access to this historic park or that museum or whatever as an enticement for people to go. So I think we have probably the opposite problem, you know, sort of like a short-term underinvestment in these sites. Not only have they lost their tourism revenue and their ticket revenue, but now they're getting, you know, into these kind of promotion campaign type things as well. Whether sites that are operated as by private concessionaires will have a different kind of trajectory, I guess it remains to be seen. I mean, I think in the long run, everyone assumes that everything is going to come back as it was before. No? So I don't think anyone is pricing kind of on like a short-term time frame. And in many cases, concession agreements anyway are locked in for like 5 or 10 or 15 years anyway. So it's probably going to extend and hopefully well beyond COVID recovery. So that's sort of an initial question. But I think the deeper question here goes back to what you were saying in terms, and it reflects what Susanna was saying in terms of some of the local antagonism towards tourism. You know, if 30% of the population is saying that we don't want tourism to come back, it means that this is 30% of the people who are feeling that tourism wasn't delivering benefits to them, either tangible benefits or economic benefits or other types of benefits. You know, they're seeing that tourism is a hassle, is taking up all the parking spaces. It's, you can never get a restaurant booking because it's filled with tourists, et cetera, et cetera. So I think, this is clearly a wake-up call, no? So I mean, sort of alignment of interests and then ensuring that tourism governance is completely rethought in terms of distribution of benefits. And so a kind of completely, corporate-driven approach with, a little bit of token CSR back to the community is probably not a viable way forward. And I think that's what 30% is telling us. It means that we need to look at other models. And actually, I think from the work that actually Stephen has done personally, in Laos, wearing his ADB or hat, or his former life, his UNESCO hat, a lot of the community-based tourism operates on a completely different DNA, so the DNA of community-based tourism is to ensure that part of the proceeds go back to the tourism, go back to the local communities, but also that the local communities are there from the beginning in the conceptualization of the products and the delivery of the products and making the products have both a brand identity and a value that people are willing to pay for. I think that's the kind of DNA that we need to begin to move to. And it doesn't mean that everything is always going to be like at an SME or a micro scale. I mean, there must be ways that this can scale up so that we can see that investors are not working against the interests of local people, but the local people are sort of there, not just in a token way, but in a kind of a more meaningful way in tourism destination planning and tourism destination management, particularly when the local people themselves are part of the attraction, especially at a heritage place, like a living town like Luang Prabang. You don't go just to, look at the beautiful temples, but you go to interact with the people and eat their food and, and listen to their music and so forth. And so I think we have many examples from Laos actually where community-based tourism is structured so that some of the tourism proceeds go directly to community-based operators and or even just communities in general. And it goes back not just to maintaining tourism facilities like visitor kiosks and whatnot, but it goes back also to monitoring the site, picking up trash at the site, and then improving local well-being at the site as well. So I think if we can use examples like that has been developed, for instance, with the Plain of Jars, for instance, where it's mandated into provincial law that X% of proceeds from the site go back to local communities. It becomes something that is part of the operating system of that site, and it's no longer just at the discretion of a private operator, whether if they have a good year that they'll put back, some small fraction of their profits into the local community. And so I think until we can set up systematic mechanisms like that, whether it's mandated in law or it's in tourism funds or heritage funds that are reinvested in local people, reinvested in local environments, and reinvested in local communities, I think until that kind of mechanism happens, then that 30% is never gonna change its mind,
No, that's fascinating, Mandir. And this idea of, what I hear is that there's actually elasticity to go up in pricing in many places, but that needs to also be accompanied with reinvestment in the destinations, with having a fair share of the benefits, flowing through different parts, so we have the economic benefits, we have benefits for the environment, but there's also this idea of, an emotional connection between visitors and the site. So they, want to take better care of the site and others, and having people that live in the destination that are satisfied with the way tourism is structured. Tourism is just as much as it is for residents as it is for visitors. This idea of, tourism centric for tourists maybe is something that we have to flip this way of thinking around, going forward to really help to push some of these more sustainable models. Again, back to people and partnerships in place. Chongpan, I want to follow up with you because it's amazing actually what Minor and you're doing in terms of training your workforce and bringing people in. One of the things we read about a lot is tourism does generally, in Southeast Asia, probably more than half of the tourism workers are female and are women. But this idea of having diversity in the workforce, especially going higher to management positions, is still a work in progress. With some of these different policies and practices that you put in place, which of those do you feel are more pertinent to women and maybe help, or just promote diversity in the workplace, but also can help to promote women as leaders and to kind of, move up into leadership positions in tourism?
I think it's a bit of both. Definitely, we have to promote diversity, but if you really look at the stats, right, it's like for within our group, we have already 150 over nationalities in our group. But that doesn't mean that diversity is, all respected by all, right? So we have to continuously really promote diversity and actually promote workplace behaviors. And we actually do have, we talked about training. So we actually do have trainings and communications that are catered for each of the locations. We have the sort of overall umbrella on diversity, key messages, but when it's drilled down to each regions, then we have specific in local languages, diversity trainings or communications or newsletters that would go out and try to embrace the concept of diversity and understanding of other people who are different. We have things like, for example, if you have colleagues from a different religion, we even have documents that say, why are they practicing these, so that we have the real understanding of why they're doing things differently. Or, in cases of diversity, I think as a mix of workforce, we do have 50-50, like what you say. What we're trying to promote more and more is definitely women in leadership. I have to say, if we look into properties like in Europe, the NH Group actually does fairly well, pretty well on having a fair share of women in leaderships. But when we look back into our other regions, I think we still can improve upon. And there are so many things that is going on in the past at least 2 years that I've seen in terms of communications and trying to empower female in our organization. Actually, last week, there was International Women's Day, and we actually held a session globally and invited actually one of our board of directors, who's also female, to talk about her experience and some of her key thoughts on how you can excel as a woman leader. And also we invited some of our management from different properties, different regions, to also talk about that experience. I happened to be on the panel as well, and they talked about my experience actually seeing women leaders in my life. I actually had my mom as my role model, for example, and also talking about how we can break that bias in the communities as well. So that goes into how we do our CSR or our sustainability initiatives in the local community that we work with. Like in Africa, we have projects where we empower the local women in the village to make peanut butter. And then we actually help them invest in the equipment, and then we buy the peanut butter for them from them, and also sell it to our guests and use it in our breakfast. They also sell it to external markets. Those kind of things are the things that we keep doing to really showcase that women can be a very strong force in the society, in the community, in the organization. And like this year's when we did the International Women's Day session, actually it was participated by over 200 people, male and female, across all our properties. So I think this kind of concept has become more prominent, and we still have to work on it. But I think we just have to reinforce the message and really showcase and empower the women in the workforce, that they can really be, doing things the same level as men. I think, in our organization, it wasn't really too much of a doubt around that area, but I think we still have to figure out how we can really push or encourage women to take more steps upwards in a very, I have to say, male-dominant organization or male-dominant industry when it comes to leaders of the hotels.
Okay, yeah, I mean, so yeah, this idea of, diversity and inclusion, it needs to be deliberate, right? It is what I'm hearing from, we need to be deliberate messages from the top, but also, just becoming the DNA of the organization, to empower people across all the different works and job titles and others. But this idea of, being deliberate and working in different programs, you've given some good examples of that. So thank you. I want to come back to this because it's coming in the question box here from the audience about stakeholder participation, right? I think everyone's touched on the importance of different stakeholders, both internal stakeholders and, we'll say external stakeholders, just in that whole tourism ecosystem. This is for you, Helena, actually, and we're impressed with your initiatives to recover from the pandemic, and we know that it involved many different stakeholders. Kind of going forward now, and we've heard also from others is maybe we want to return to 2019, we don't want to return, what can happen? How do you think this enhanced collaborative spirit, and coming through a crisis is going to equip the tourism industry to better foster sustainable development? You can speak to Macao, or you can speak to other destinations as well. So over to you, Helena.
Yeah, thanks. Well, collaboration is very, very important, and we learned that long before, because we are a very, very small destination, so we can't. Well, we have our own good points, but at the same time, we also have we also have a lot of constraints ourselves. So in order to make our own destination more sustainable going forwards, and also to be able to be more competitive, so to speak, in a very, very difficult, I would say a very, very competitive situation all around the world. So we need to really work with our neighbors. And that's why, even just before the pandemic struck, we have enjoyed quite good collaboration from our immediate neighbors, especially what we call the area of the Greater Bay around the Guangdong area, which is a new development area which the Chinese central government has marked out. And recently, of course, we have another new collaboration or a new working scheme with one area which is just across the border from us, called Hangqian, which is an island, which we have a very new model of collaboration there. But I think collaboration has to be you have to find win-win situations for everybody. So it cannot be, someone wins, someone loses. You have to find a way that all the partners are able to gain from the collaboration. So within Macao, we are working together with both big and small operators. When we're talking about the big operators, we're talking about the big gaming concessions. When we're talking about the small ones, these can be the SMEs, plus also those businesses not necessarily directly in the tourism industry, but they benefit from tourism. I talked about the concept of tourism plus initially, in the beginning of the session. This is also something that we are leveraging, trying to, push forward this kind of spirit, meaning to say that we're now trying to work together with the cultural side, the creative industries, the sports side, the meetings, conventions, plus also, the small businesses around town, because we feel that it is only in a collaborative way that we can move forwards. We can find new products, new ways to do business, and probably learn from each other. And then obviously the outer collaboration will be with our immediate neighbors to start with. This is what I think in the mainland context, we're always talking about the two circles, the inner circle and then the outer circle. So we have to actually work both ways in order that we can really move forwards. It's still very early days. I think we're finding new ways of working together. We need to try out new ideas, and we need to also be a little bit more inventive, and also we have to give a little bit more of our I would say endeavors into untouched grounds as well. So yes, it will give you a lot of rewards, but I think we need to really find ways that are beneficial to all parties.
Yeah, thank you, Lena. You know what? I don't know if I envy your job, but what we often hear is everyone's using the tourism resources, and it's so multi-stakeholder. It's so hard to get everyone together and get everyone on the same page to do that and move forward. You've shared some great examples from how Macao is doing that. With what can be very, very huge pressures, with very large amount of visitors, and in a relatively small area with amazing built and intangible heritage. So. I guess maybe we need more articulate tourism managers like yourself, that can sit at the center of that process, and bring people together. So this is interesting. We have a question from the audience. Actually, it's for you, Suzanne. This one is about. We're going to come back to investment. And a little bit touches on about what Mantiera had mentioned as well, is this idea of strengthening linkages between tourism revenue, and I think in this place maybe we both public or private revenue, and there's different various ways of mobilizing, revenue from tourism. How do we direct some of those investments towards sustainability? What's an example of a mechanism that you've seen work in that space? Over to you.
Yeah, it's obviously one of the key problems for tourism to receive sort of ideally sustainable funding to advanced sustainability, and one very common tool, I guess, is taxes and levies. New Zealand actually is an example where we have the visitor levy to support conservation projects. Of course, it sort of disappeared with the disappearance of international visitors, but it's still there. Botswana has a similar one. There's lots of examples for local levies, but then there's obviously other instruments as well, maybe direct support of R&D. And I mentioned earlier about aviation fuel. There's actually quite a few, Singapore, Korea, the UK, where the government is literally investing usually in public-private sector partnerships to foster that. In the sort of course of the pandemic, quite a few governments around the world have specifically put up innovation funds. And I think that's sort of one of the exciting things out of the pandemic, I guess, that, and I've heard it across the panelists, that we came up at Macao, for example, with new ideas, new products, new technology. So I think that hopefully a long-term, because ultimately if it's targeted at increasing the value of tourism, it's hopefully a good return for government. And by value in that case, I mean above economic, higher value visitors, but also maybe some of the other outcomes I mentioned, value to the community, value to the ecosystem.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, and it's a good you bring that New Zealand levy. Actually, I was looking at that. I think, you know, people, they can find it on the New Zealand, I think it's Tourism and Trade Ministry. That was tagged onto the airline ticket, if I'm not mistaken, right? You know, which mobilized a lot of resources for support and destinations.
That's right, and it's debated now, of course, because as international travel starts again soon, what's the right level? Shall we still use the opportunity to increase it because we want to do more transition funding, exactly like you asked, or whoever asked the question. So that's sort of happening in the moment.
Good. Okay, great. Listen, I think, you know, wow, it's amazing. Time flies. You know, we're almost through an hour and a half now. It could probably go all afternoon, and I'd certainly be loved to doing this if we were doing it in person over coffee. But let me just touch on a couple of points, okay? Then I'm going to come back to the panelists actually to close. You know, we've heard a lot about COVID-19 policy responses today, and, you know, understandably, what's happened around the region is there's been a lot of focus on immediate assistance, right? To help businesses recover, help workers weather the downturn. You know, however, we've clearly seen today at the panel this mindset of let's get through this pandemic and then we'll worry about sustainability later. Is, you know, consumers aren't going to stand for that, residents aren't going to stand for that, and destinations that aren't addressing sustainability are certainly not going to be competitive and, you know, touch that box. I think it was on the left-hand side of Suzanne's slide. We heard about many pathways today on how destinations can foster more sustainable change. Apart from those related to value-led tourism, we heard about diversification, tourism-led regeneration and partnerships, different ways of improving tourism governance. You know, that's going to be specific to the destination and the context where those happen. And we've heard some good examples from around the region. And we certainly, you know, need to emphasize this idea of, you know, decarbonizing tourism, making tourism more climate friendly, and aligning tourism, both behavior of visitors, behaviors in the destinations, and finance to better align with the Sustainable Development Goals. We really have a unique window of opportunity to create more sustainable terms of tourism. We certainly don't hope that lessons, you know, were lost or will be lost. So maybe we can just go around the panel, you know, in the order that we started. And I'd like to hear from the panelists as well, as maybe if you can share with us quickly, if I may, just kind of a personal lesson from the pandemic. And, you know, and what lesson you're going to take forward from that, you know, to help with this idea of sustainable tourism transformation, whether it's in your destination, whether it's in your organization, your business, or even for yourself, you know, a lesson that we could leave the audience. So, Helena, let me start with you, please.
On my side, I think well, there are lots of lessons learned, but one very important, I think very importantly is get your locals on your side. Get your partners to work together, and then obviously, you know, give out messages that are, you know, that gives confidence to people coming back to your destination. I think that's what we have learned.
Fantastic. Kun Chom Han.
Thanks. Yeah, for me, I think it's important to be resilient, but at the same time be flexible. too dangerous. We thought COVID will stay with us for a few months, but then it drags on to 2 years. So we just have to preempt what's going to happen. Sometimes it doesn't happen the way we preempt, but in that case, I think we always have to look at, some opportunities and areas that we can move forward to really strive forward. And at the same time, don't lose focus on what you think is important. So sustainability cannot be forgotten. It needs to be in your DNA as an operator. You can't just leave it for 2 years and then try to reconnect. So these kind of things, you just have to be true to yourself.
Nice. Mantira.
I think one of the main takeaways is that the sustainability of tourism is really based on the sustainability of the tourism resources. And if those resources are, local environment and culture, then I think this current crisis is an opportunity to find ways to improve governance and to improve market mechanisms to ensure that we're reinvesting in these resources.
Nice, thank you. And Professor Suzanne.
I guess one takeaway for me is both from the industry that I work with, but personally, how adaptable we all of a sudden can be when we're in crisis. When it's a choice, you say, oh, no, I can't do this. But all of a sudden, here we are. And it's maybe not perfect, but it's still great to be on this panel. And maybe the second one is just the passion that many who work in tourism have for their sector, for their place and community, and just being creative and making it work. So that was actually quite heartening.
Nice. So I've heard things like, cooperate, right? We really need to cooperate to get through this and to make ourselves stronger and more resilient for the future. This idea of, being both flexible and being focused at the same time is important. Yeah, we need to be flexible, but we also need to stay focused on the prize. And that's sustainability. Reinvest and protect those resources that make, I'll say, Southeast Asia, but really all of our tourist destinations so special, both for the residents and for the visitors. And this idea of, creativity and flexibility, others, reinvestment in destinations that you've made are really some important takeaways. From my side, I'd just like to say that, yeah, we really have this unique window of opportunity. Again, going forward to create more truly sustainable forms of tourism that are in line with the Sustainable Development Goals. Maybe we can avoid trying to create, new and improved versions of the past of 2019, and look forward to, really working together to build more sustainable forms of tourism that are more ambitious and more transformative. So with that, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I certainly want to thank all the panelists for a very engaging conversation. Maybe we have to meet in all of our destinations, for a follow-up coffee. I'd certainly love to continue the conversation where we all live. Open invitation to my home in Luang Prabang when we can all travel again. So to close, just on behalf of the Asian Development Bank and the Pacific Asia Travel Association, who've been fantastic in helping us to organize the panel, along with many others at the symposium over the next day or so. We sincerely thank you for joining the session, and we certainly thank you for the enlightening discussion. Thank you very much.